We're all here.
Okay. Oh, I'm ready to start anytime you guys are ready.
Give us 1 second.
Okay.
Larry's got it. Yeah.
So are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Albert Bender, and I'm the chairperson of the Indigenous Peoples Coalition. And I'm holding a press conference along with supporters from the community. And the purpose of the press conference is to announce a community meeting that will be held today. And the theme of the community meeting is to resist ICE. And in particular, the theme is to resist the assaults of ICE on Latino people, because Latino people are indigenous people. The Latino people are either ethnically indigenous people or of indigenous descent. And an assault on them is an assault on all indigenous people.
Yes.
Because people from Mexico, Central America, and South America, again, are primarily indigenous people. And for Trump to have ICE assaults upon them is a form of ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
Ethnic cleansing. And it's ethnic cleansing of Latino people from this country. And we have to look at it. For thousands upon thousands of years, indigenous people have crossed the borders, the so-called borders, the so-called Mexican-American border, the so-called Canadian-American border. And it is patently wrong for the illegal, and I will say illegal, Trump administration to criminalize this movement. The movement of indigenous peoples across the so-called borders should not be criminalized. And to criminalize it is a crime against humanity. Also, what I want to say very strongly is that we stand in defiant opposition to the enforcement of inhumane, anti-humanitarian laws. And I will go on record as saying I advocate very strongly for the so-called violation of these inhuman laws. Governor Lee has a proposed bill that is supposed to take effect on July the 1st. And this bill says that it will be a crime to harbor or assist immigrant people if in their attempts to avoid ICE. And I will say this, I stand in utmost opposition to this law, and I advocate for, and I will harbor, I will assist in helping immigrant people to avoid ICE deportation. I will say further that immoral, unjust laws should not be obeyed. And we have a history of this in this country. Look at the fugitive slave law in the 1850s that was enforced to maintain the slavery of African American people. People broke the laws then, and people were justified in breaking the laws. Further, in a more recent breaking of so-called laws, the segregation laws that were broken during the 1950s and 1960s, under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., that was another case of the breaking of injustice, immoral, and anti-humanitarian laws. Further, we have the example of this clownish representative, Andy Ogles.
Yes.
Andy Ogles. And let me refresh some people's memory of Andy Ogles. 2, 3, 4 years ago, Mr. Ogles decided to produce a Christmas card. And on that Christmas card were Mr. Ogles, his wife, and pre-teenage children. And on this Christmas card, he had all of them holding AK-47s. How crazy is that?
Crazy.
Yeah, you don't get any crazier than that. And now, Andy Ogles is asking for an investigation of Mayor Freddie O'Connell for his condemnation and the righteous condemnation of Freddie O'Connell for the ICE raids. And we stand in defiant opposition to the ridiculous, absurd actions of Andy Ogles. Furthermore, I would like to see, for those of you who are have some time and have some determination, to think about putting together a task force to deal with opposition to the ICE laws. And further, I want to say that the Indigenous Peoples Coalition stands in solidarity with the administration of Mayor Freddie O'Connell in the condemnation of the outrageous, absurd laws under which ICE operates. Furthermore, the Indigenous Peoples Coalition calls for the abolition of ICE.
Yes.
The abolition of ICE, and further, if the ICE representatives continue, there must be new ways devised to fight ICE. Because right now, things aren't getting any better. Things are getting worse. In Los Angeles, just in the past overnight, like the past couple of days, the outrageous ICE raids are continuing despite protests from people all over California. At this point, I will end my presentation in terms of the position of the Indigenous Peoples Coalition and welcome, very much welcome, any questions from the media. I thank you.
You had mentioned that you'd be willing to go to great lengths to protect those who are trying to flee ICE. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and talk about why that's so important to you, just briefly.
Well, why that is so important to me is because this is a moral question. This is a question of helping out fellow human beings. And not just because of the fact that the Latino immigrants, migrants, are of indigenous descent and many of them are ethnically indigenous, but it is a moral question. And I will put it further. I will not only assist migrants to avoid ICE deportations, I'm willing to be arrested. I'm willing to go to jail to make the point. And I think that for those of us who feel strongly about this, that there needs to be a civil disobedience, there needs to be some means of standing up further to Trump, because the actions of the public right now are not strong enough to stand and stop Trump's outrageous assaults upon indigenous humanity. And again, I go on record by saying that I am willing to be arrested in terms of helping out migrants avoid ICE deportations. And in fact, if there were ICE representatives here now, I would say, hey, tough guys, arrest me. I dare you to arrest me.
And also you said something about you're calling for the ICE to be abolished. What are some of the solutions to our country's immigration problem?
Well, I don't really see that from the viewpoint of indigenous people that we have an immigration problem. One of the prime tenets or prime principles of the indigenous peoples movement is, and I quote, no one is illegal on stolen land.
Right.
And as long as we embrace that tenet, that principle, as far as I'm concerned, there is no immigration problem.
And you touched on a community meeting happening. When exactly is that going to occur, and what the specifics of that meeting?
Well, the community meeting will take place right after this press conference, at which representatives from the community will speak, and there will be further discussion on how best to confront and deal with ICE assaults, not just on indigenous people, but upon all people. Again, that is something that is a moral question, and it was a moral question in the 1800s, it was a moral question in the 1900s, and people have to stand up and do what is right for morality.
So, like on behalf of your organization, what are you encouraging people to do when they're confronted with agents from ICE?
Well, I'm encouraging people to follow the laws, the rules that have been enunciated under the Constitution of the United States. There are rules in dealing with ICE for, if you're confronted with ICE at the border, if you're confronted with ICE at airports, if you're confronted with ICE at your workplace, if you're confronted with ICE at in your car, if you are confronted with ICE on the street. And I am encouraging people to engage in legal resistance to ICE. And another point I want to bring up, and this is comes from the head of the Tennessee Highway Patrol, stating that in reference to the recent ICE raids of May the 4th through the 6th or 7th, that the stops of indigenous people, the stops of migrants, were not based upon color. That is a bald-faced lie. How is it that 468 traffic stops were conducted by the Tennessee Highway Patrol, and those 468 traffic stops were overwhelmingly of people of color, of migrants? For the head of the Tennessee Highway Patrol to make that statement is blatantly a bald-faced lie. And in fact, I will even recite that years ago, I was stopped coming from Rutherford County, driving back to Davidson County. I was stopped by a Laverne policeman. So I pulled over, and the policeman says to me, did you know that one of your tail lights is broken? I said, no, I didn't. So I got a ticket for that. But after I got home, I had my wife to check the tail lights, and my tail lights were working perfectly. So that just goes to show you the spurious excuses that law enforcement tries to use against people of color. And again, 468 traffic stops, it's ridiculous, again, for the Tennessee Highway Patrol to assert that they were not based upon people of color.
And my last question, I guess, what's the call to action? What's next for you guys after this press conference, this moment? Where do you go from here?
Well, that's a very good question. A very good question. In the sense that I don't have all the answers. No one person has all the answers for how best to deal with the ICE assaults and the racism of the Trump administration. And that is the purpose of this community meeting, is to see if we can all put our heads together to come up with some way of assessing the righteousness of actions to combat ICE assaults. And again, that is one of the purposes of the community meeting.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have anything in mind on how to help undocumented people, or how to help them in case of another raids in the metropolitan area?
That is another good, very excellent question, because I have pondered that ever since the raids of May the 4th. And, excuse me, a lot of the rest of us who are in opposition to the ICE assaults have recommended, very strongly recommended, contacting our elected representatives, expressing to them our outrage at these assaults. And I'm not discouraging people from contacting their representatives, but keep in mind that so far our so-called representatives have not stepped up to the plate. They have not stepped up to the plate to assert themselves on this righteous cause. So again, as I said, I don't have all the answers to this, and I'm, quite frankly, looking for answers from others in the community.
Thank you.
And I also might add, this is another experience I had in the 1990s. I was coming from the Native American Indian Association offices when the offices were downtown in the Stallman building. And walking from the Stallman building to where I was parked on the street, as I proceeded to unlock the door to my car, all of a sudden, I'm surrounded by policemen. 2 to 3 cars of policemen. They come out with their guns drawn. And I'm like saying, hey guys, what's going on? And their explanation was, they said that they had a report that a Mexican man, had just robbed a bank. And the policeman's exact words to me were, they said, you fit the description to a T. And I thought, I don't know any Mexicans who are as tall as I am, but I guess there are some. And after I had displayed my ID, told them who I was, told them that I was coming from the Native American Indian Association, they let me go with the admonition. They said, Mr. Bender, I would recommend that you get out of the downtown area as soon as possible. They said, because as long as you drive around here, you're going to get stopped again and again and again. And so that, and I thought to myself, well, I could have ended up being a martyr. And if I'd been a martyr, I said, gosh, that would have been a real good press for the cause. And I said, well, I don't really want to be a martyr right now. But that just goes to show how the effects of racist assaults are on brown people. And also, I would say, on all people of color. Now, are there any further questions? Okay. Well, I will end the press conference at this point, and we can all get
this podcast.